Hi, welcome, and thanks for joining our panel. I'm Bozorgmehr Sharafedin. I'm the head of digital at Iran International. As you know, the Iranian economy has been under significant strain in recent years, mainly because of sanctions, Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and also because of corruption and inefficiency. Iranians have experienced significant hardship. They've seen a sharp fall of their currency, and they have also experienced electricity and water shortages. The last thing the country needed was a war, yet it experienced two wars in less than a year. So I think the main question is, what would be the costs and consequences of this war for Iranians and for the world? And would that be the final tipping point for the Islamic Republic? Or maybe it can still manage it if it can survive the war. We will ask these questions from our wonderful panelists. We have here Jason Brodsky, Policy Director at United Against Nuclear Iran. We have Miad Maleki, former senior US Treasury official and also senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Mohammad Machine-Chian, senior economic analyst at Iran International. Jason, let me start with you. How much risk was Trump ready to take when he went to the war with Iran? I mean, was it a calculated risk, or was the administration caught off guard when it came to the economic consequences of the war?
Well, it's great to be here and wonderful to see all of my friends at Iran International and Miad and Mohammed as well, and you, Bozorg. I think the short answer is President Trump was willing to assume a lot of risk. It was an unprecedented amount of risk compared to his predecessors in office. If you look and go back to the Biden administration, if you had suggested that President Biden would be willing to greenlight an operation to take out Iran's supreme leader, I think people would have said, you're out of your mind. Will never happen. If you had suggested President Biden would have been willing even to strike targets on Iranian soil that would even, like the IRGC headquarters or certain military bases in response to Iranian-backed militia attacks on U.S. forces in the region, which happened during his tenure, I think people would have said it would never happen. And I remember reporting back then, which suggested that there was a lot of speculation that in response to Iranian militias' drone attacks, rocket attacks against U.S. forces, which sadly culminated in the deaths of American service members, there was some speculation in the press that there would be an Iranian strike, a U.S. strike on Iranian soil. But I remember that Jake Sullivan and other U.S. national security officials said that strikes on the Iranian soil were not on the table. So we were in a situation where the Islamic Republic could attack everyone, but could never be attacked itself. And that was eroded U.S. deterrence. And I think under President Trump, he viewed his decisions dating back to his first term as being vindicated due to minimal Iranian pushback. So if we go back to his decision to withdraw from the JCPOA in 2018, if you'll recall, people said if President Trump does it, World War III will break out. Well, he did it, and World War III didn't break out. If President Trump took out Qasem Soleimani in 2020, World War III would have broken out. Well, guess what? World War III didn't break out. There was a strike on the Al-Assad Air Force Base in Iraq, which injured U.S. troops. But I think in the president's mind, it vindicated the risks. The high risk turned into a high reward for the United States as it took Qasem Soleimani off the field, and with him, it disrupted a lot of Iranian operational planning in the region. Even if you go back to 2019, when President Trump was considering designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, you heard the same voices. World War III is going to break out. The Iranians are it's going to be open siege on American forces. Well, guess what? It wasn't. He designated it, and other countries have followed since then, including the European Union, which many people thought would have been unthinkable just a year ago. But it happened. It was thinkable because of the step that President Trump took in 2019. Now, if we look at the Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, when President Trump undertook that option, again, striking Iran on military and nuclear sites on Iranian soil for the first time since 1979. People thought that that would also result in World War III, but it didn't. There was an Iranian attack on an American base in Qatar as a result. Now, all of those decisions and steps really emboldened President Trump to think that he could launch Operation Epic Fury and manage its fallout. And I think we're still seeing that assessment play out in real time. I think the president, in contrast to a lot of commentary that's out there, which is just a lot of noise, has a very predictable strategy. What he does is engage in a version of coercive diplomacy against the Islamic Republic. He lays out the military option, prepares the theater for U.S. Central Command, and we've seen this happen during Operation Midnight Hammer. We saw this happen even in Venezuela, and now we saw it in the lead up to Operation Epic Fury. He then offers a diplomatic off-ramp for the Iranian regime. He lays out U.S. terms and gives a deadline. And if the Iranian regime doesn't play ball, he strikes. And I think that we may see that same game of coercive diplomacy happen and unfold in the coming weeks again. There might be another round of fighting if the U.S. is not getting the kind of deal that it wants.
So I agree that Trump took a high risk, unlike previous presidents, maybe in the last 47 years. But if the war continues, which country or which side will pay the higher price, Mihran? Do you think US, Iran, or the world economy? Among them, which one has the weakest stamina to give up?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Great to be back here with Iran International and you, Bozorg. Just before I get to your question, let me just add to great articulation that Jason just kind of put before us on where we are today with President Trump dealing with the Iran file. You know, it's my perspective is President Trump has been searching for the moment that there is sufficient leverage economically and militarily to cut a deal with the Iranian regime. I mean, I don't think President Trump priority has ever been a regime change. He always campaigned on ending wars and conflicts in some elements of, I wouldn't say isolationism, but focusing domestically as opposed to being more so involved in external conflicts. So President Trump during his first term, started where Iran has significant leverage. I mean, they just had received billions of dollars in economic sanctions relief. They had their nuclear enrichment program was basically legitimized, received international recognition. They had access to funds, foreign currency accounts, and they had some foreign investors coming in. And so President Trump went in, and it took him about 3 years to get to a point that we could start implementing a meaningful, effective, maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And I'm happy to get into the details, but I keep hearing this argument that there was a 4 year of maximum pressure campaign during the first Trump administration, and we didn't get where we wanted to get at the end. But the reality, you get into the details, it was really a 1 year half campaign. Due to the legal restrictions, to the realities of where we are here in DC, some disagreements, within the government, outside the government. And so the pace of maximum pressure campaign didn't really keep up with what President Trump wanted to see as far as the leverage he wanted to build with Iran. And then we had a 4 year of Biden administration, different policy objectives. That kind of helped Iran to build up actually more leverage with the U.S. and the West. And then President Trump is back in the office with this understanding that he took out Soleimani, and a year later, the Iranian regime officials were in Vienna negotiating with Rob Malley. At the time when Soleimani was taken out, my first reaction when I saw pictures on CNN of his hand, the first picture that came out confirming his death was that, I thought this regime would never negotiate with the U.S. This is it. This is the most, the closest commander to Khamenei. There's no way these guys are going to come back to the deal to engage in any kind of negotiations with the U.S. And here we are, a year after President Trump was sitting in Florida and watching how the leverage that he finally built up with Iran to an extent led to Biden administration having that momentum in Vienna. And now he's back in the office, and there's a political clock. There are 4 years. There's a midterm coming up. And based on his previous interactions with the Iranians, I think President Trump had a really good understanding that these guys are going to come back to talk, regardless of what happens. And he's right. I mean, Khamenei was taken out, and Ghalibaf was in Islamabad negotiating with Vice President Vance and Witkoff and others. So I think the risk that President Trump took was, I think there were some elements of, I wouldn't say that President Trump wasn't expecting. U.S. government was surprised to see Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz or blocking the Strait of Hormuz. For decades before I went to the Treasury Department, I was at CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command in Tampa. And even when Iran's file was passed on to the State Department over the nuclear program, because there's a point in time that Iran had a robust enrichment program, and that became the tool of, I would say, diplomatic blackmailing for the regime. So Strait of Hormuz wasn't really the talking point within the ROGC commanders. Yet CENTCOM stayed focused on the Strait of Hormuz. The issue of the Strait of Hormuz was not something that I would say that the administration wasn't expecting to happen. But I guess there's some element of resistance that we're seeing from the regime, especially coming after January protests in Iran, that I think we're a little bit surprised to see how they're still unwilling to engage to the extent that I think the administration was expecting them to engage in talks. Especially given the fact, and getting back to your question very quickly, that if you look at the numbers, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has, I would say, Iran's economy is the most vulnerable economy in the region or globally to a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. For 47 years, they've been threatening the world with closing the Strait of Hormuz. They sent $1 billion a year to Hezbollah. They invested in Hamas. They've done all these kind of investments in means of deterring foreign intervention, yet they didn't really think about, well, if we're at the point that we have to close the Strait of Hormuz, can our own economy handle $455 million a day in trade that we have to rely on going through the Strait of Hormuz? And I think the administration had some level of understanding. I would be surprised. I left in August, but I would be surprised if President Trump's senior advisors didn't put those numbers before him, that, hey, there's significant economic pressure that Iran's going to have to deal with on the import and export side, and happy to get into details later, if they choose to close the Strait of Hormuz, especially given the war economy, the currency collapse, the gasoline cliff that they have to deal with. But at the same time, we see how the regime is still willing to resist. Right.
Because now we see that Iran is closing the Strait of Hormuz and US started a blockade. So in a way, it's like Iran is putting sanctions on the world by blocking that strait. And blockade is US finally using its military power to implement the sanctions. So both of them, both the world economy and the US economy and Iran, are paying a high price. And I think the question is, many are asking who will blink first. What do you think?
Well, I mean, well, I just said regime always blinks first. I mean, again, we've seen over and over, they come back to talk. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, what's most important for this regime is its own survival. We know that for a fact. We all know that in this room, that's all they care about, to stay in power. But at the same time, they do have a 10-15% of hardcore supporters that they need to maintain some level of legitimacy within. And if they give up the enrichment program, if they give up what's happening in Strait of Hormuz to maintain some level of control, then they're going to have problems at home too. I mean, the 10-15% armed supporters who continue to keep them in power, they need to make sure they maintain legitimacy with that portion of the population. So I think they have their own internal problems too. But going back on the sanctions issue, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's some real concerns about the implications of what's happening in Strait on world economy. And Asia is the first, North Korea, Japan, China, and India, they're 89-90% of their petroleum, 75% of their natural gas comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And, we're not here in the US, we're not the main target of the economic ramifications of the Strait of Hormuz, but what's happening in those countries will affect our economy. So that's, the clock is much faster on Iran's economy side than it is on our own side. But we know historically that the Iranian regime, that doesn't really care, to the extent that Iranians are starved or, dealing with major economic issues.
I agree that Iranian economy is deteriorating much faster, but the problem is how to measure it. Like, we have a global stock markets, and you can see the impact of war on the US economy and the Asian economies. But the problem is that Iran's stock market has been closed since the start of the war. It's more than a month ago, I think.
8 weeks.
8 weeks. So what does that tell us? And what is your prediction, Mohammad? If the moment that the stock market in Iran opens, what's going to happen?
This is an interesting question, and it's been a point of debate currently inside the country, of course. And as you mentioned, the stock market has been closed for the past 8 weeks. It is unprecedented in the history of Tehran Stock Exchange. And they were supposed to open it up last week, but they postponed it. And then postponed it just this Saturday for another week. And if the situation continues to unfold as it has been, I'm expecting the postponement to continue.
Is it normal to close down the market for this long under emergency or war condition in other countries?
No, even to take United States, for example, after the 9/11, I think they reopened the market on September 17, so less than a week later. And it's been 2 weeks since the ceasefire, and they haven't been able to open it up. And of course, the policymaker inside Iran is pretending that everything is normal because all the prices are as they used to be before the beginning of the war. But we know that's not the case. And it's not just war. I would argue that the context here matters, really. And Tehran Stock Exchange was in crisis mode, even before the war began. And you cannot really see it if you look at the numbers, because if you have a look in 2025, the nominal profit was 37%. So in every market, that should be a very good year. But when you take into account that the country has been afflicted by 70+ inflation, then you see a better picture, I would say. And another factor is that in that market, so give you a couple of examples. Banking is in shambles. Iranian banks for obvious reasons. They're detached from the international financial infrastructure, of course. The government is using them basically as their own to, borrowing to pay for the salaries and what have you. So that's banking. The car industry, again, it's deep in red. And the stock market was relying basically on exporting industries, namely petrochemicals, steel, and and oil and gas related basically companies. But most of those companies have been hit, have been destroyed partly at least. The estimates we have, and we don't have good estimates, and that's another problem, because when you don't have estimates as an investor, how can you rely on the stock market? But even using rough estimates, at least it's going to take a couple of years to rebuild the infrastructure, the destroyed infrastructure. At least it's going to take a few tens of billions of dollars, to be generous, and money they don't have. And you actually, it was a very good, I think, I looked into into the numbers, and 435, if I'm not mistaken, daily. And Dubai no more being there, Dubai being the main channel that they receive Forex basically into the country. When you take all of that into account, even if they reopen the market, there's no petrochemical, there's no steel, they have to rely on the banks, car manufacturers, and other industries that rely on basically petrochemicals to begin with in their supply chain.
Like pharmaceuticals.
Plastics, pharmaceuticals, and down the line, of course. So the situation, they don't really have any options to reopen the stock market. It's going to crash. Of course, they have some measures already in place. For example, they limit the loss after 5% drop every day. The price cannot go any lower. It doesn't make any sense. Nonetheless, that's the way they're managing it. But even in that scenario, I don't think they can afford to open the market.
So that's the picture inside Iran. So these are, I think that's a good estimate of what is happening in Iran, to see what is the Iranian stamina to continue the war. But coming into the US, gasoline prices are up $1 per gallon. And I think we are going to the summer season, which is the driving season in the US. And we have the shortage of jet fuel, which is, that means that the airlines will be highly affected. Jason, do you think President Trump has the political capital to spend on this war? Like he said in his post on through social that the price of the high price of gasoline is a very small price to pay for the U.S. peace and I think security. Do you think the Americans will buy that? Are the Americans ready to pay that price?
Well, I think President Trump is in his second term, and traditionally presidents in their second term are focused on their legacies. And so I don't think, while the president, of course, wants Republicans to retain Congress during the midterm elections, I think he's more in legacy mode right now. And that was one of the reasons, I think, why he decided to launch Operation Epic Fury, because he thought, yes, it was high risk, but also potentially high reward, because he is a person who branded his political rise as America First. And if he could be the president on whose tenure the regime which chanted death to America was birthed in chants of death to America, that would be quite fitting and appropriate for him. So I think he was willing to absorb these risks to weaken the Iranian regime, and viewing regime collapse and ultimately regime change as a bonus. But it wasn't a core, regime change wasn't a core objective of the president's campaign. The core objective of the president's campaign was degrading the ability of the Islamic Republic to project power beyond its borders, degrading its military apparatus, its missile program, its drone program, its nuclear program, its leadership. And I think on those measures he has succeeded. But it is a work in progress, and it's going to require likely further kinetic steps by the United States. And the United States has achieved with diplomacy, with force, what it has been unable to achieve with diplomacy. Because remember, before Operation Epic Fury, before Operation Midnight Hammer, let's look at that. The Iranian regime before Operation Midnight Hammer would have never even considered a year's worth of suspension of enrichment of uranium. Would never have considered it because it already had a stockpile of highly enriched uranium to 60% and rapidly growing enrichment capabilities. But after Operation Midnight Hammer and after Operation Epic Fury, we're still in the middle of it, it is now considering, reportedly, a years-long suspension of enrichment of uranium. That, in and of itself, is an achievement by the United States, and it's a vindication that, yes, military force has to be part of a successful Iran strategy. Now, getting back to the political question that you asked, I think that President Trump is willing to go at this for longer than most people expect, and he has said so publicly. He is willing to take that risk because he is in legacy building mode at the moment. And I think the Republican Party and the Republican members of Congress and senators have mostly been cohesive and have stuck by the president's side. The Democratic side, you've had a very small minority of voices on the House side and on the Senate side who have been more receptive to U.S. military strikes, but the vast majority of the Democratic Party has been against Operation Epic Fury and has been, I think, using it as a political cudgel against the Republicans because they view it as a way to come out on top during the midterm elections. But I think that the president does have some time, and he's more in legacy building mode right now. And that's, I think, the frame of mind that he's approaching the decision making regarding Operation Epic Fury.
Yeah, regardless of President Trump's goal for this war, I think many Iranians are looking to see if this will lead to a regime change or not. Miat, let's imagine three scenarios, like the regime collapse, or the Islamic Republic will remain, but will go through fundamental changes, and I would say as far as normalizing ties with the US. And the third one is that it remain as it is. In all these scenarios, how Iran's economy would look like? I mean, knowing that the main pressure on Iran's economy is the US sanctions, and you've been in the Treasury. So in these scenarios, how we can predict the Iranian economy?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think we can discuss this for hours. But the short answer is the sanctions, U.S. economic sanctions, international sanctions, been working not because of how governments have chosen to enforce them, adapt them, take them, implement them domestically or not. It's really the private sector. The decisions that are made in headquarters of large corporations, and whether they want to have an business that is tied to the U.S., they want to have U.S. dollar accounts, they want to have U.S. businesses or clients, and that JCPOA was really a great lesson learned for not just folks in the Iranian regime like Zarif and others who really thought a deal, an agreement like JCPOA can bring about significant economic opening to Iran, but also for U.S. policymakers that in the case that we have an Iranian regime that agrees to all 10, 15 points, in my view, if they do agree to 10 to 15 points, that's a regime change, right? But let's say that they agree to 10 to 15 points that we've seen bouncing around. And now we have some kind of agreement that comes with some revocations of some executive orders, some sanctions programs, access to frozen funds, and but when it comes down to actually a transition from an embargo, a full sanctions regime on Iran to the point of an open economy, then we're gonna go back to the day that JCPOA was agreed on, and now as a part of that agreement, U.S. government wanted to comply with part of that agreement and provide Iran a couple $2 billion in cash, in funds. And the policymakers in the government, they thought, okay, well, we're giving comfort letters to the banks. We're going to call a couple of CEOs of banks, and we're going to get this money to you guys. And then when they actually reached the point of having the funds determined, we're going to move the funds from this account, we're going to give it to this bank, to move it to this other bank, they couldn't find one single bank, not just U.S. banks, but little tiny banks without any corresponding relationship with U.S. banks to actually touch the money. At the end of the day, they had to put the funds on a pallet and send them in cash, right? So even if we have an agreement that comes with all these type of, I would say, in an ideal kind of, or in a normal course of agreements that comes with some sanctions relief commitments, you're going to have phase-by-phase relief or revocation of sanctions. It'll take months, if not years, to really come to a point. Look at the case of Syria, that you actually have private sector feeling comfortable to get into an economy that was subject to significant economic sanctions for decades.
But yet, I think Syrian sanctions were much easier than Iran. Iranian sanctions are much more layered, and it's much more difficult to remove them. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we went through this. I went through this practice with the Biden administration to understand the sanctions that we have designed, how we can start lifting them if there was some kind of agreement. And we couldn't, it took us weeks to understand what we have put in place as far as sanctions, in addition to legislations and everything else. So you're right, Syria was an easier case. There was a political transition. There was an international recognition of this government, and we did lift sanctions, yet Syria is still dealing with significant roadblocks on setting up bank accounts, getting investments, even from Gulf states to invest. So if there is some kind of a ceasefire and we are going back to where we were pre-war, then we go back to where Iran was in January. As I said, a currency collapse, a market that Mohammad explained very well, that is, I would argue, from U.S. economic point of view, is an economy that is already bankrupt, is already collapsed. So the regime is going to have to deal with that. I don't think their days are counted, economically. If we go back to pre-war economy and nothing changes politically between U.S. or diplomatically, and if we end up in a scenario that we give them access to the frozen funds, but we go back to where we were pro-war, then they're going to have some cash flow. It's going to help them for a while. But then there's this structural economic issues and political issues in Iran. Iranian economy is subject to, it's blacklisted globally. The FATF provisions that would not allow even some governments to consider investing in Iran. So there's structural economic problems in Iran that even if you have a regime change tomorrow, in addition to the three scenarios that are laid out, if we have a democratic government today, a transitional government established in Iran today, and the Islamic Republic is gone, that transitional government probably not going to be able to pay government salaries for more than a week or two. So absent any kind of sanctions relief or access to funds or some foreign financial support. So that's the reality of Iran's economy. It's very dark. But again, that's just where we are today.
I will come to take some questions from audience in a few minutes. But before that, Mohammed, does the Iranian economy have that much time? Does it have years to wait for sanctions relief to come? Or because we see a lot of pressure on Iranian currency real, uh, it's not traded at the moment. The volume is low, but even it's very difficult to gauge the real number of the currency, which shows, which is a sign of collapse by itself. Does the Iranian economy have enough time to survive years of sanctions relief in the best case scenario?
Well, I think the framework you put forward is a good one to work with. Let's imagine this in these three different scenarios. To give you some context, compared to US dollar, Iranian rial was 800K in the beginning of 2025. By the end of 2025, it was 1.6 million. So basically, the value was slashed in half. And for the best case scenario, if we want to indulge in an overdose of optimism, if there is a comprehensive agreement, which at the moment doesn't seem very likely, but nonetheless, I think we can take JCPOA as a starting point and then factor in the difference in the situation, in the Iranian situation, the infrastructure, the inflation, inflationary pressure, and everything else in between. I think we're dealing with at least a 5% a month inflation for the rest of the 2026. That gives you around an 80% inflation. So 80% increase in average prices
In a year.
in a year. And that is also taking into account, and I'm very interested to know your take about this, that Scott Bessent's Treasury has shown incredible agility in sanction waivers and what have you, and assuming there will be some relief if that scenario happens. In the more likely scenario, I think no war, no peace, as the senior Ayatollah used to like to say. In that scenario, I think that the situation will be much more grave. And in that scenario, I think to begin with, we can factor the last couple of months ending in the second war. In January and February, the inflation reached 8% a month. Starting there and assuming it will increase 1% every month or every couple of months. By the end of the year, we're dealing with 12%, 11% inflation a month. This is more than 200% increasing prices, basically. And so the price of average goods will be tripled. In an unfortunate but at the moment likely scenario that another conflict will start, I think, again, we can start from January, February inflation, but factor in 1%, 2% every month. By the end of the year, I think the inflation will be above 20% a month. And you see the trend. I'm talking about inflation in months, no longer in years. And that is the reality we're dealing with. In that case, we're talking about 500% inflation.
Well, how does that reflect in daily life of people?
The daily life of ordinary Iranians, as we speak, is intolerable. So ever since the war started, I remember less than 5 years ago, I think this is a good example. I wrote for the first time, I used to talk about policy and economy of Iran in Iranian newspapers. For the first time, I wrote an editorial about eggs. Became so intolerable, so expensive. It was 27K at that moment. We're talking about four and a half years ago. When the war started, it was 270K for a box of eggs. Right now, as we speak, we're dealing with 450K for a box of eggs. This is not sustainable.
They have government rushes.
There are mandated prices, but good luck getting them. Good luck finding them. And you have to, of course, stay in a very long line and hope for the best. But even then, it is intolerable. I don't think it's sustainable for any reasonable administration that has the daily lives of their own people as a priority. I don't think they would continue. But it is a different case when you're dealing with the Islamic Republic.
So we can take questions from audience. Yes.
Thank you, Aaron. This is one of the best panels I ever seen about Iran, honestly. Very smart panel. Special thanks to Mia because I stole your post on X and I've been using it all over the place. But the import and export of Iran is amazing. It's the best. I'm an Iraqi American, and my nephew was a U.S. soldier who was kidnapped and killed in Iraq by Iranian-backed militias, or say mullahs-backed militias. So I'm best invested in about the militias. One of the things I'd like to ask Mia and the rest of the panel is the Iraqi militia now are the government, and the U.S. State Department narrative during Biden to support the Iraqi government against the militias is a hoax. We know that. And now there's a Wall Street Journal today says more than half of the attacks on Saudi Arabia were coming from Iraqi militias. We know that. And I wrote an article in the Washington Examiner suggesting two solutions. One, sanctioning the Iraqi government for paying the militia salaries $3 billion. You can see it in the Iraqi budget. If you pull the Iraqi budget, the militias, the PMF, which is all the militias, getting paid $3 billion, sanctioning the Iraqi government unless they cut off the militias, and also cutting the dollar from Iraq from the Federal Reserve, which is, I heard now is happening. What's your thought on this, Mia? Do you think such sanctions feasible, possible in the near future? Thank you.
Of course. That's a great question. Where we are today with the PMF, Hashd al-Shaabi, is where we ended up being with Hezbollah about 15 years ago. And that's Iran's playbook. The way they set up their proxy groups. Iran only had a Kataib Hezbollah, and then it had Muqtada al-Sadr, and then added this Asaib al-Haq, and then Badr brigades, and they kept, creating all these branches. And then what they usually do is, they encourage them to get involved in political activities. Right. And then we had a administration, U.S. administration, came in and said, we can't really just address this issue of Iraqi Shiite militia groups through kinetic operations or political pressure on the Iraqi government. We need to find a different solution. And the solution was, we're going to create this umbrella organization called Popular Mobilization Force. And then we're going to place it under the Ministry of Interior, if I remember correctly, which has been historically under the control of Hadi al-Ameri and Badr brigades. And then, government is going to control this. They're going to get this under control. When in fact what happened, that was a catalyst basically for the Shiite militia groups to become a very strong bloc in the parliament and in the Iraqi government. Now, the Iraqi government relies on U.S. economic support. They're still not economically independent. They don't, Iraq after Iran is taking, is the second country in the Persian Gulf that is taking hit over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because they have no exit out of the Strait of Hormuz, right? So economy that depends on fossil fuels, economy that is dealing with corruption, and there were steps taken by Treasury Department to cut off the U.S. dollar auction to some of these banks, but really at this point, what I would see as the only long-term solution to the Iraqi Shiite militia groups problem is really a fall of the Islamic Republic in Iran. If they're not being funded by the Islamic Republic, and you might disagree, you know way better than I do, then maybe there would be some hope that their allegiance, they would shift away, hopefully, from Qom to Sistani or to some other or maybe some sense of nationalism as opposed to revolutionary ideology that they can focus on. But I've become very hopeless as far as, pressuring the Iraqi government directly through economic sanctions. We've done that for years. They get cash from Iran. They get their arms from. They have land borders, so there's no way for U.S. government to get involved in disrupting the flow of funds and arms. So it really comes down to how we can pressure the Iraqi government, and the pressure is backlash, because again, they depend on us so much economically. So as much as there are ways that we can slow down the process of having a major Hezbollah problem in Iraq, it's really just hoping that the regime change in Iran would lead to some level of political change in Iraq as well.
One question there.
I wanted to ask you about the economy was already bad before the war in January. That's why they were in the streets, protesting. So it was already a problem. What if the RGC regime is out? Meaning not just the philosophy, but also all the money that is going to Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis and all of that. That money that would not go there could be used in the economy. Yes, it's going to be hard, but there is at least from, I'm not Iranian, but I would say, okay, I'm going to eat potatoes and hard bread, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So my question is there something politically or that could encourage the people of Iran to really get up, but this time with the support of much more countries, not just the US, but also you have the European that would eventually kind of at least not be opposed, let's say at the most, but have some power. And of course, with the Mossad, maybe have arms or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a real politician, but there are many things that are not said, but that do exist behind the curtain there. So is that something that is
Yeah, I'm happy to maybe quickly give you, and then Mohammed and Jason, feel free to chime in. The hope that I'm seeing here is the point that the Islamic Republic can't pay salaries of the RGC, the Basij militia, its arms of oppression. I think 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 of regime supporters, those regime inner circle, are charlatans, and 1 or 2 are core supporters of the regime. They ideologically believe in the regime. If that 9, 8 out of 10 are not getting paid, then they might just decide not to go on the street and kill their fellow Iranians and support the regime. And I think that's the point where you're going to see an domestic opposition movement that can lead to a regime change. Otherwise, we saw, the difference between pre-1979 monarchy and in today is they had an amazing passport. They could travel to majority of countries without visa. So when they saw the demonstrations on the street, the king said, they don't want me. Let's just get out, as opposed to having to kill. He got on an airplane. His folks got on the airplanes. They flew to U.S., to all capitals in Europe. These guys can't go anywhere. They're stuck because of sanctions, because of the visa restrictions. They don't have a passport that they can really travel anywhere to. So really, at the end of the day, they have to fight or get killed. And my hope is they would have stopped fighting. A big portion of that regime supporters hopefully would just choose not to fight if they're not getting paid, and they kind of realize that this is just not worth it. But I don't know, Mohammed and Jason.
Yeah, well, I think that if we look back to Operation Midnight Hammer, there were a lot of predictions during that operation that Iranians would rally behind and around the flag, and they would support the regime. But guess what? Months later, in December and January, December 2025 and January 2026, there were mass protests that rocked the Islamic Republic. And I think this is going to be a story that plays out over a long period of time. And I can see a similar situation happen today, after the bombs stopped dropping, when the Islamic Republic really gets its hands on the extent of the damage, when the Iranian people see the regime in such a weakened state, that they too, once again, come out into the streets. And, I think that there could be an opening down the line, as Miad was saying, especially when you can't pay salaries. That's going to encourage people to engage in civil disobedience and civil unrest. So I think we can see a similar cycle like that play out right now. And, the Islamic Republic's decision-making apparatus has also become increasingly destabilized and fractious. I think decision-making has become much more diffuse. They can't come to decisions as maybe easily as they did before Ali Khamenei was killed, because it was such a centralized personality of power, under his system of leadership, that this is going to really destabilize the regime, I think, in the long run. And, in contrast to a lot of the commentary that you hear out there saying the Islamic Republic is emboldened, it's not going anywhere, that's bunk. Okay, I think the Iranian people see this regime for what it is. It's weak, it only relies on terror and repression. And I think that the economic, social, environmental, political drivers that have driven Iranians into the streets from 2017 to the present have only gotten worse. And so there's only one direction here in the long run, and that is in regime change. And the Iranian people have come to that conclusion a long time ago, well before the United States did, well before Europe did, and our allies and partners did. And so I think that this is a process that is going to continue to play out, and this is why the very short-sighted takes that Iran has won this war are really, really misguided and are really missing the point of this operation. Let's not also forget how degraded the U.S. has made the besiege apparatus in Iran amid Operation Epic Fury, Israel as well, with strikes on besieged installations, on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' intelligence organization headquarters, on Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps ground force bases. These are the instruments of state control, and they have become eroded. And this was in a very significant way. This is unprecedented. So the views here that the Islamic Republic is not going anywhere, there's nothing the Iranian people can do, I don't buy that. And I don't think any one of you should either.
I have time for one more question.
So there have been a lot of ideas and things floated around, for example, that we'll pay Iran cash, for instance, for their enriched uranium stock and so on. So basically, Iran obviously needs a bailout of its current situation if its economy does not crash. And there is a possibility that they can extract that from administration through, theoretically at least, the cards off the Strait of Hormuz plus the enriched uranium. They could manage somehow to pull something off. The administration could manage to pass them billions of dollars, maybe a palace of cash again. I don't know. But theoretically, that could happen. What would be then the scenario? Are we looking then at a possibility in which the regime can then reconstitute itself and perhaps actually rebuild its capacity and capabilities in 10 years' time, 15 years' time? So then we get another Iran, Islamic Republic in Iran, that's maybe nuclear even in 15 years. Do you see a scenario like this possible?
Should I start? I think the worst thing that we could do right now is to flush the regime with cash. It's going to use that to rebuild its missile program, its nuclear program, its drone program, and all of its repression architecture. So that's the worst thing we can do, and the first thing we should do is do no harm. This regime is in a real hole, despite what the mainstream media will have you believe. Unfortunately, they have adopted the victory narrative of the Islamic Republic, and that helps Tehran. Doesn't help the United States, doesn't help our allies and partners, doesn't help the Iranian people, helps the Islamic Republic. And right now, the worst thing we can do is empower this regime when it's at a historic weak point. So if I were advising President Trump, I would tell him to continue cranking on with the economic pressure campaign. Now it's called Operation Economic Fury. Continue Operation Epic Fury unless and until the United States gets the kind of deal that it wants. And I remain skeptical that we're ever going to get to a durable, sustainable, nice diplomatic outcome with this regime as long as it's in power. So well, that may require the United States to continue fighting. So be it. We have to continue to erode the power of this regime because it's going to present a real and present danger not only to our national interests in the United States, but those to our allies and partners, and most importantly and critically, and we cannot overlook this, the Iranian people's national interests, because I fear that there's going to be massacres and a real crackdown in Iran, because this is what happens traditionally. We saw this at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. I think that we need to keep our eye on the ball here, and don't forget that the Iranian people are the ones and the first victims suffering here. So the worst thing we could do is flush this regime with cash and resources.
I think Jason covered it very well. It's, there wouldn't be a cash. It would be extremely unlikely that we have a cash transfer situation here. There are legislations that would really just would block, executive branch from moving forward with a provision of cash to Iran. Things have changed since the JCPOA. And sanctions relief are usually designed that it could be scaled back. So there are funds that Iran already has access to. These are the $20 billion frozen funds or restricted funds, or they're not really blocked, but funds that are sitting in different countries, Iraq, Oman, Qatar. These are funds that Iran technically has access to use for non-sanctionable goods. Now, whether President Trump would make a decision to give Iran access to the funds for something beyond non-sanctionable goods, meaning potentially some sanctionable type conducts, given the fact that they're not in US dollars, they wouldn't be subject to US primary sanctions, meaning there's some leeway there, that there's some flexibility that president can exercise there with those funds. That'll be give regime a lifeline. They have 71%, 70% of the metal production that is dropped. Metals are usually the quick cash access for the regime, same as petrochemicals. They have 60 to 80% drop in petrochemical production. Those are the two sectors that usually turns into quick cash for the regime. So sanctions relief on petrochem metals can regime really benefit from those. On the petroleum side, you have layers and layers of legislations, executive orders that really put a strong sanctions on petroleum. So at the end of the day, we all need to pay attention to the details here of what comes out of Islamabad. That's going to really set the stage for the next, years of Iran's internal, economic kind of state.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for your great questions and thanks for your insightful answers. Hope you join us for the next panel.